Hey, everybody. Merry Christmas. Welcome to this episode of the Joyful Poodle podcast with our host, Toto, and me, your co host, Father Nathan of the Joyful Friar podcast. Well, today we're happy to have Toto with us. He is dressed for Christmas. I just came from a Christmas party. And today we're talking a little bit about uh, well, the etymology of Christmas and what it means anyway. And I'm particularly interested in trying to share the spirit of Christmas with any of you who might want to share of it, who might not be Christian or know very much about the idea of the Christ. That's what we'll talk about just a little bit right here. How's that with you, bud? Let me tell you that the origin story of Toto. He is not my dog, but he is my best dog friend, aren't you? He belongs to my best friend, Father Richard, who lived in Tucson for a long time, and I, of course, live in Tucson now, but I only moved here 5 years ago. For many years, both Richard and I were active priests. He's since retired, but we were always busy in December until the last Christmas thing, the last Christmas Mass, turning out the lights, locking the place up, and finally coming home to, a chance to do your own Christmas celebrating. And I really like that week between Christmas and New Year's where everything moves a little slower. Offices are not fully staffed and everything like that. When for many, many years after I would be finished wherever it was that I was living at the time, the day after Christmas would be the day that I would fly to Tucson, visit Richard. We'd play golf. It's much of my priesthood. I've lived in places further north and colder, and so Tucson was a real sweet getaway. Well, anyway, a few years ago, 6 years ago, do you remember? It was 6 years ago. Uh, it was the day after Christmas, and Richard was coming to pick me up at the airport for our visit. And in the back, he had this guy. He had a big standard poodle, the 60-pound kind, big fellow named Jonah. And Jonah was a church dog. He would hang out at the door and greet people, and he was just very well known to the staff and regulars, visitors to the church here. But Jonah had died, and Richard, in his own way, kept asking for a new pet. He tried a couple of puppies that just didn't work out. He had a heart ready for a new pet and prayed for a little dog. And a friend of his knew of a dog that was unhappy living on a farm in southeastern Arizona where he was kept in a crate most of the time. He was only let out late at night or at feeding time at night with big dogs that he had to compete with at the food bowl and the water bowl. So anyway, when I got to my bags at the airport, Richard picked me up, and he was really sick with the flu. He really shouldn't have been out at all, but he had two things to do that day. One of them was to pick up Toto for the first time, remember? And to pick up me at the airport. So Toto was in the back in the crate, and he didn't know Richard. He certainly didn't know me. But by the time we got back here, Richard just kind of crawled into bed for most of the time that I visited, just stayed in bed, and it was Toto and me getting to know each other. So he felt safest inside his crate. So we put the crate on the floor of the laundry room, and I just sat on the floor of the laundry room trying to get him to eat, but he was too scared. So I had that, wet dog food that comes in a can. I just put some of it on a spoon and put it up to his nose and held him to my heart, just trying to assure him that he was safe here and he would be fed the minute he felt like eating. Well, it did take a while, but he did keep sniffing at the food, and eventually he looked at it and had a little bit to eat, and I brought in some water, and he was able to take a sip of water, and that's how we kind of got our start. So over the next few days, I held him a lot and spoon fed him whenever he felt like eating, and then we became buddies. You're my buddy, aren't you? He knows my ringtone on Richard's phone and tries to answer the phone when I call, don't you? Yeah. Well, anyhow, uh, I get the best of both worlds. I can't really have a dog in my current mode of life in the community where I live, but I get to be with my best dog friend here. I think I call him as Jesus is the human face of God. I call Toto the canine face of God. I wrote my first book was "And Toto 2: The Wizard of Oz as a Spiritual Adventure," and my read on the Toto character in the Oz story is that he's the one that's with you always, not not seeking something he doesn't have, accompanying or waiting for you to be at your best before he hangs out with you. If you remember in the story, Dorothy is an orphan and we don't know why. She's loved and loves this little dog, Toto, whose name means totality, everything. Uh, and the dog's life is imperiled at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. The neighbor next door wants to kill Toto. In that book, I mention the Moses story, the Jesus story, and the Toto story. Each start with an imperiled innocent. Remember, Moses had to be put in a basket and floated down the river because they were killing all the Hebrew babies. Uh, Jesus had to be gotten out of town and gotten safely to Egypt because they were killing all the babies again, all the male babies. And then, Toto is imperiled at the beginning of that story. So they all share that in common. Except you found a safe place to be, didn't you? That's a little bit of just a little bit of that story. But today we're talking about Christmas, and I thought I'd start with the word because I love words. I'm going to start with the second half of Christmas, the MAS part. It really is from the root word mission. A mission involves purpose and oftentimes being sent on a mission, like by someone who has the authority to send you and authorize you to do something important. So that's the MAS at the end of Christmas has to do with mission. Well, Christ at the beginning, the Christ mission, Christ is a Greek word. It's related to chrism, ointment. Think of any kind of ointment that you've used for a healthful purpose, some sort of in Arizona, it's dry and hot, especially in the winter when have indoor heat. I have to use more like skin lotion just to keep from itching, or maybe chapstick, just something basic like that. Although I know maybe some of you use really nice perfumed oils. I know some people in their spiritual practice use different kind of scented oils, maybe alongside incense. In the ancient world, the Jewish people had a practice of using precious ointment lavishly, pouring it over the head of someone as a sign of their importance and of their status. Instead of putting a fancy hat on their head like a crown full of jewels, they would take expensive ointment and pour a whole bottle full on top of somebody in order to indicate to everyone around that this person was so beloved and perhaps appointed for an important role in the community. So the idea of someone being anointed, Christic, even the word christening comes from that kind of idea, is really a Jewish concept. But that's a Greek word. It translates the Hebrew word Messiah. Maybe you know the word Messiah from Handel's Messiah. I've loved that as part of my Christmas. I know the bass line of lots of different parts of it, and there's some places where people gather in a theater, maybe with a live orchestra, and sing it together, and maybe bring their own music from home and sing their parts and so on. It can be really lovely. Well, Messiah for the Jewish people was a word that always had to do with leadership, and leadership that had been anointed for service. But over the history of the Jewish people, um, being anointed for service, it belonged to three different classes of people. Uh, One were the priests, whether in the Hebrew tradition, the Catholic Christian tradition, lots of other traditions, indigenous traditions, and so on, where some sort of priest or priestess operates, there's often some concept of there being a separation between the divine and the human. Sometimes it's spatial. I just pointed like this. Sometimes the divine is thought to be up and we're below, and the the priestly person tries to narrow the gap, tries to bring the two together, sometimes in ritual, sacrificial ways, incantations or specific kind of ritualized prayers and actions to to bring the whole community, not just him or herself, but the whole community in touch with God. So that belongs to the idea of priesthood. In fact, when a Catholic pope is referred to as the pontiff, pontiff is from pontoon, a temporary bridge. A pontoon bridge often is there because, for example, in wartime, very often it's a strategic move on the part of one of the parties in a war to blow up the bridge to keep the other guy from being able to supply their lines or whatever like that. And then they might have to come back in and build a temporary pontoon, sometimes a floating bridge. Well, the pontiff, uh, Pope Francis, is thought of in that way, that he's a bridge between humanity and divinity, between ourselves and God, and that quality belongs to any priestly person. And in fact, in our Catholic tradition, when we're baptized, all of us are baptized into the gifts of priest, prophet, and king. Well, anyway, the in ancient Israel, when you're getting sleepy, or am I boring you? Boring? No, I'm not boring. Not right now. I'm just talking to these people. The priest in Israel always operated on behalf of the community and tried to keep them close, attached to God. The prophet in Israel, there were a couple of kinds of prophets. One kind was sort of brought up in seminary, and they were sometimes from a family where that was the family business, was being a prophet. And sometimes those prophets were really on fire with godly energy and promoting a godly message. Other times they were just kind of functionaries who had the job, but maybe not the fire behind it. But oftentimes in the history of Israel, God would raise up some unlikely person who happened to work as a dresser of sycamores, like in a lumber yard. Or other prophets just would like come on the scene, like a John the Baptist would just be somebody that had no particular pedigree, but seemed to have a gift for helping people see the presence of God and hear the voice of God. Sometimes in prophetic speech, the prophet, in a reading that might be used at, in my case, Christian worship, there might be a narrative voice that's saying, the prophet Isaiah went from this town to that. And when he got there, he met somebody, and then he said, hi, my name is Isaiah. So there's two voices. There's a narrative voice, the Isaiah voice, and then at some point, Isaiah begins to allow the voice of God to move through him, and he'll say, thus says the Lord. And then what follows isn't really Isaiah's initiative any longer. It's the voice of God saying something like, I want you to stop oppressing the poor. So there'd be a third voice, the voice of God moving through the voice of Isaiah. Well, anyway, that charism of prophecy belongs to the Christ. A prophet, when he became officially recognized as prophet, would have a ceremony where he was anointed with sacred oil, blessed oil, or at least just anointed with the breath of God. If he wasn't part of a formal religious system, people would just say he has the anointing of the Spirit. of the breath of God. God speaks through him. God's breath is in him. So priest, prophet. Well, the last one was kingship. Israel, like a lot of other places, had periods of time when it was ruled by kings. King David was the greatest of the Jewish kings. They had a line of kings, and like with any kingly lineage, when you look back on it, there's highs and lows. There's some people that were absolutely great at serving the people, and others times they were horribly scandalous or just ineffective. But anyway, Israel ran the whole gamut of different priests. Of kings over time. But the kingly authority to act on behalf of the whole people and promote the good of the people was important to the Hebrew people. And oftentimes the prophets had to call the king back to his authority. Sometimes they would get too caught up in the trappings of palaces and food and drink and all of the sumptuous clothes. Sometimes the prophet would have to come back and be their conscience and say, you get out there and help your people. So anyway, all of those three charisms of priest, prophet, and king belong to a Christic person, to an anointed person. I was baptized when I was 3 weeks old. It happened to be on April Fool's Day. So there you go. But I was baptized really small at 3 weeks old. And our faith is that I became a member of the Christ. I took on the charisms of Christ-likeness. And I believe that the category of Christ does not belong only to Jesus of Nazareth. He kind of opens the category to all who will follow him. And the fullness of God's Spirit can be given to anyone who's receptive of it. In fact, in John's Gospel, John understands that the breath that was in the torso of Jesus of Nazareth, the breath that was in his body, left when he expired, which in the Greek means to breathe out. So on the cross, in John's Gospel, Jesus expires, and then that holiness, that breath of God that brought the universe into existence when God spoke and things came to be, that breath that was used to preach, to speak, to heal, that breath was now available to anybody with nostrils. You've got nostrils too. I think you are the Canine Face of God, buddy. Well, anyhow, when someone wishes you the spirit of Christmas, maybe you're not a Christian or an active Christian, would invite you to kind of try it on. If there's something in you that makes you interested in looking at a podcast like this one, maybe you're just at an unusual moment in your life this December, and you know that there's all this Christmas stuff going on around you, and you know there's more to it than just the commercial side. Maybe you're receptive to the spirit of Christmas. Well, I believe that was always intended to be universal and not religiously sectarian. So if that is of interest to you, you can ask for the spirit of Christmas. That would be the spirit of the anointed one, and you might be brought into the mission of spreading the goodness, because I believe it's universal. Well, that's enough for right now. This has been this episode of The Joyful Poodle with Toto the Christ and your co-host, Father Nathan. So thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time. God bless.